Joining us now from London is Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan, who in 1991 took part in the invasion of Iraq and was awarded medals by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait for defending their people in the war. And Colonel Kemp, thanks for joining us. We'll get to the aftermath of the war in a minute, but from the war itself, from the battlefield, what do you think were the most significant lessons or changes that came just from the fighting, from the conflict itself?
Well, I think, one thing that was particularly impactful on me being there at the time was the massive amount of military force that was deployed by the United States, Great Britain, and other coalition allies, including, of course, France and Arab countries, bringing it to bear against the Iraqi army. There was no chance going to be taken. It wasn't going to be, as we've seen in similar conflicts more recently, where there have been much less of a margin of superiority. We had absolute superiority. And flying over the desert, as I did from time to time in a helicopter, you could see, as far as the eye could see, there were tanks, there were infantry, soldiers, artillery, engineer vehicles, logistics vehicles, and tents, people everywhere, all over the desert. It was a phenomenal build-up. And I think, speaking personally, the incredible edge that intelligence gave us, so we knew pretty much exactly where the enemy was due to aerial surveillance and not so much drones in those days, but satellite surveillance, was quite extraordinary. I think that then has developed and plays an even more significant role in conflict these days. And one factor which I think gave us enormous superiority operating in the desert, which is notoriously difficult to navigate in, was satellite navigation systems. It was my first experience of using those systems. And they proved, I think, without a doubt, they did prove to be absolutely vital in our ability to pinpoint an enemy and then get close enough to engage him, even through sandstorms.
Right. Now, in retrospect, I would say the most controversial decision made in that war was President Bush deciding, rightly or wrongly, not to pursue the fight into Iraq and to leave Saddam Hussein in power. Was that something that was understood by those of you who were fighting at the field at the time? How did you react to that? And what do you think do you think it was the right decision at the time?
I think at the time it was the right decision. Whether or not events subsequently would have unfolded differently if we had gone to Baghdad and taken out Saddam, obviously I suspect it would have been a different world today had that happened. But I believe at the time it was the right decision taken by the US president predominantly. And partly that was to do with, I would say mainly it was to do with maintaining a coalition because, of course, our presence there and our ability to operate in that theatre where we depended on Saudis and Kuwaitis and other Arab countries for, in order just to be able to supply our forces, never mind having forces to fight with them. That was vitally important, the essential nature of the coalition. And I think the judgment was taken at the time that had we gone on further into Iraq and taken down the regime in Baghdad, that would have eroded support from the coalition, from our Arab coalition allies. And actually, one other thing that we were conscious of, not so much right at that time at the end of the conflict, but during the conflict, conscious I'm speaking to you in Jerusalem tonight, we knew very well that Saddam was firing Scud missiles into Israel. And one of the biggest fears, I think, of those of us who were on the ground was that Israel would retaliate, as it really was entitled to do, and would not show the restraint that in fact it did show, because that also potentially could have fractured the coalition if Israel had come in effectively on the side of the coalition against Saddam by protecting its own people from Scud missile fire. That could have been potentially very, very serious. And we were watching and listening and waiting and seeing what Israel did. And I was actually in some ways quite surprised that Israel showed the immense restraint it did show. I know it's a controversial restraint, but I think in retrospect, again, it was the right thing for Israel to have done.
Now, I did mention, Richard, you received medals from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and of course, this conflict increased the military involvement of, let's say, the Western world into the Gulf area. I wonder, is it possible to draw a line from that first Gulf War and the involvement especially of the United States in defending that area, even to this year's Abraham Accords, in which, for example, the U.S. played such a key role in sort of breaking that ice between the Gulf and Israel?
Well, I think, funnily enough, the Abraham Accords owe, to an extent, their origins to almost the opposite of what you've just put forward. In other words, I think you can trace their immediate cause back to the time when President Obama decided effectively to favor the Iranian regime over his traditional Sunni Arab allies in the region. And when he decided to go for the nuclear deal with Iran, which, of course, as most of us know, paved the way for nuclear weapons for Iran, of course, that created terror among our Gulf allies, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries out there, which when Prime Minister Netanyahu went to the Congress in 2015 and made his famous speech there standing up against that policy decision, I think that was the first occasion when really the Arab countries there recognized finally that Israel and they had common cause, which led pretty much directly to the Abraham Accords. So it was kind of almost a perverse reversal of the kind of alliance that we had during the first Gulf War.
Very briefly, can I ask you, do you think you will see, even in your lifetime, or a U.S. military commitment in the Middle East comparable to the, let's say, the two operations against Saddam Hussein?
Well, let's just hope it's not going to be necessary. But I think if there is a further need for significant U.S. and allied intervention, military intervention in the Middle East, it will be against Iran. It won't be, obviously now Iraq is a pretty close ally to Iran, but it will be, I think, in response to what I see as, to an extent, a growing Iranian threat. That can be prevented. That need for any military intervention can be prevented by the new president in the US, President Biden, taking a strong stand and maintaining the previous administration's maximum pressure regime against Iran.
We'll have to leave it on that. Colonel Richard Kemp, thanks for joining us on The Rundown.